The Dream of the Rood is one of the earliest Christian poems in the corpus of Old English literature and an example of the genre of dream poetry. Like most Old English poetry, it is written in alliterative verse. Rood is from the Old English word rod, pole, or more specifically crucifix, preserved in the 10th century Vercelli Book. The poem may be as old as the 8th century Ruthwell Cross, and is considered one of the oldest works of Old English literature. Background information. A part of the Dream of the Rood can be found on the 8th century Ruthwell Cross, which was an 18 feet, free-standing Anglo-Saxon cross that was perhaps intended as a conversion tool. At each side of the vine tracery are carved runes. On the cross there is an excerpt that was written in runes along with scenes from the Gospels, lives of saints, images of Jesus healing the blind, the Annunciation and the story of Egypt, as well as lating antiphons and decorative scroll work. Although it was torn down and destroyed during a Protestant revolt, it was reconstructed as much as possible after the fear of iconography passed. Fortunately, during the time of religious unrest, those words that were in the runes were still protected in the Vercelli Book, so called because the book is kept in the Italian city of Vercelli. The Vercelli Book, which can be dated to the 10th century, includes 23 homilies interspersed with 6 poems: The Dream of the Rood, Andreas, The Fates of the Apostles, Soul and Body, Helene, and a poetic, homiletic fragment. Possible authorship. The author of Dream of the Rood is unknown, but by knowing the approximate date of the Ruthwell Cross, scholars have been able to suggest possible authors. These include the Anglo-Saxon poets Caedmon and Cynewulf. Knowledge about Caedmon, who flourished in the middle of the 7th century, comes from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. According to Bede, Caedmon was an illiterate herdsman who one night dreamt how to praise God by singing beautiful Christian verses. Caedmon then became the foremost Christian poet, who led the way for others such as Bede and Cynewulf. Old English scholar and noted commentator on the Ruthwell Cross Daniel H. Hay argues that the inscription of the Ruthwell Cross must be fragments of one of Caedmon's lost poems, stating on this monument, erected about A.D. 665, we have fragments of a religious poem of very high character, and that there was but one man living in England at the time worthy to be named as a religious poet, and that was Caedmon. Another runic scholar, George Stevens, contends that the very language and structure of the verses in Dream of the Rood could only have come from the 7th century and a time before Bede. Considering that the only Christian poet before Bede was Caedmon, Stevens makes the point that there could have been no one else during this time period living in the same area that could have authored the poem other than Caedmon. Furthermore, Stevens claims that there is a runic inscription on the Ruthwell Cross that, when translated, comes to mean, Caedmon made me. Despite this evidence, most scholars reject the Hay and Stevens assertion that there is in fact such an inscription. Cynewulf lived roughly c. 770–840 AD, yet very little is known about his life. The only information scholars have on Cynewulf's life is what they can discover from his poetry. 2 of Cynewulf's signed poems were discovered in the Vercelli Book, which includes Cynewulf's Holy Cross poem, Helene, as well as Dream of the Rood, where many scholars will argue that all of the poems in the Vercelli are in fact Cynewulf's. The noted German scholar Franz Dietrich demonstrates that the similarities between Cynewulf's Helene and the Dream of the Rood reveals that the two must have been authored by the same individual. Dietrich makes four main arguments. 1. The theme of both poems is the cross, and more importantly, in both poems, the cross suffers with Christ. 2. In Eileen, Cinewolf seems to make clear references to the same cross in Dream of the Rood. 3. In Eileen and his other poems, Cinewolf usually speaks of himself, which makes it quite possible that the dreamer in Dream of the Rood is none other than Cinewolf himself. And finally 4. In both poems the author represents himself as old, having lost joys of friends and is ready to depart. The poem is set up with the narrator having a dream. In this dream or vision he is speaking to the cross on which Jesus was crucified. The poem itself is divided up into 3 separate sections, the first part, the second part and the third part. In section 1, the narrator has a vision of the cross. Initially, when the dreamer sees the cross, he notes how it is covered with gems. He is aware of how wretched he is compared to how glorious the tree is. However, he comes to see that amidst the beautiful stones it is stained with blood. In section 2, the cross shares its account of Jesus' death. The crucifixion story is told from the perspective of the cross. It begins with the enemy coming to cut the tree down and carrying it away. The tree learns that it is not to be the bearer of a criminal, but instead Christ crucified. The Lord and the cross become one, and they stand together as victors, refusing to fall, taking on insurmountable pain for the sake of mankind. It is not just Christ, but the cross as well that is pierced with nails. Adele J. Theme remarks, the cross itself is portrayed as his Lord's retainer whose most outstanding characteristic is that of unwavering loyalty. The Rood and Christ are one in the portrayal of the Passion. They are both pierced with nails, mocked and tortured. Then, just as with Christ, the cross is resurrected, and adorned with gold and silver. It is honored above all trees just as Jesus is honored above all men. A cross then charges the visionary to share all that he has seen with others. In section 3, the author gives his reflections about this vision. The vision ends, and the man is left with his thoughts. He gives praise to God for what he has seen and is filled with hope for eternal life and his desire to once again be near the glorious cross. Structure of the poem. There are various alternative readings of the structure of the poem, given the many components of the poem and the lack of clear divisions. Scholars like Faith H. Patton divide the poem into 3 parts, based on who is speaking: introductory section, speech of the cross, and closing section. Though the most obvious way to divide the poem, this does not take into account thematic unity and differences in tone. Constance B. Hyatt distinguishes between portions of the cross's speech based on speaker, subject, and verbal parallels, resulting in prologue, Vision I, History of the Rood, Vision 2, Explanation of the Rood's glory, Vision 3, the Rood's message to mankind, and epilogue. M.I. Del Mastro suggests the image of concentric circles, similar to a chiasmus, repetitive and reflective of the increased importance in the center. The narrator dreamer's circle, the Rood's circle, Christ's circle, the Rood's circle, and a narrator dreamer's circle. Paganism and Christianity. Like many poems of the Anglo-Saxon period, the Dream of the Rood exhibits many Christian and pre-Christian images, but in the end is a Christian piece. Examining the poem as a pre-Christian piece is difficult, as the scribes who wrote it down were Christian monks who lived in a time when Christianity was firmly established in Anglo-Saxon England. Anglo-Saxon influence can be identified by the use of a complex, echoing structure, allusions, repetition, verbal parallels, the ambiguity and wordplay of the riddles, and the language of heroic poetry and elegy. Some scholars have argued that there is a prevalence of pagan elements within the poem, claiming that the idea of a talking tree is animistic. the belief in the spiritual nature of natural objects, it has been argued, recognizes the tree as an object of worship. In Heathen Gods in Old English literature, Richard North stresses the importance of the sacrifice of the tree in accordance with pagan virtues. He states that the image of Christ's death was constructed in this poem with reference to an Anglian ideology on the world tree. North suggests that the author of The Dream of the Rood uses the language of this myth of Yngwie in order to present the Passion to his newly Christianized countrymen as a story from the native tradition. Furthermore, the tree's triumph over death is celebrated by adorning the cross with gold and jewels. Work of the period is notable for its synthetic employment of pagan and Christian imagery, as can be seen on the Frank's casket of the Kirby Stephen cross shaft, which appears to conflate the image of Christ crucified with that of Odin bound upon the tree of life. Others have read the poem's blend of Christian themes with the heroic conventions as an Anglo-Saxon embrace and reimagining, rather than conquest, of Christianity. Despite the pagan elements, the very nature of The Dream of the Rood is based upon Christian beliefs. The poem deals with the passion, death and resurrection of Christ as a triumph over sin and evil, the strongest mark of Christian faith. The dreamer, in his converted state, remarks, "May the Lord be my friend, he who here on earth once suffered on the hanging tree for human sin. He ransomed us and gave us life, a heavenly home." Here the dreamer realizes that Christ's death was not only victory in battle, but also the way in which human salvation was secured. The poem may also be viewed as both Christian and pre-Christian. Bruce Mitchell notes that The Dream of the Rood is the central literary document for understanding resolution of competing cultures, which was the presiding concern of the Christian Anglo-Saxons. Within the single culture of the Anglo-Saxons is the conflicting Germanic heroic tradition and the Christian doctrine of forgiveness and self-sacrifice, the influences of which are readily seen in the poetry of the period. Thus, for instance, in The Dream of the Rood, Christ is presented as a heroic warrior, eagerly leaping on the cross to do battle with death. The cross is a loyal retainer who is painfully and paradoxically forced to participate in his Lord's execution. Christ can also be seen as an Anglo-Saxon warrior lord, who is served by his thanes, especially on the cross, and who rewards them at the feast of glory in heaven. Thus, the crucifixion of Christ is a victory, because Christ could have fought his enemies, but chose to die. John Canitson believes that the poem shows Christ's willingness, indeed his eagerness, to embrace his fate. It also reveals the physical details of what happens to a man, rather than a god, on the cross. This image of Christ as a heroic lord, or a heroic warrior, is seen frequently in Anglo-Saxon literature and follows in line with the theme of understanding Christianity through pre-Christian Germanic tradition. In this way, the poem resolves not only the pagan-Christian tensions within Anglo-Saxon culture but also current doctrinal discussions concerning the nature of Christ, who was both God and man, both human and divine. Other interpretations. J. A. Burrow notes an interesting paradox within the poem in how the cross is set up to be the way to salvation. The cross states that it cannot fall and it must stay strong to fulfill the will of God. However, to fulfill this grace of God, the cross has to be a critical component in Jesus' death. This puts a whole new light on the actions of Jesus during the crucifixion. Neither Jesus nor the cross is given the role of the helpless victim in the poem, but instead both stand firm. The cross says Jesus is depicted as the strong conqueror and is made to appear a heroic German lord, one who dies to save his troops. In Instead of accepting crucifixion, he embraces the cross and takes on all the sins of mankind. Rebecca Hinton identifies the resemblance of the poem to early medieval Irish sacramental penance, with the parallels between the concept of sin, the object of confession, and the role of the confessor. She traces the establishment of the practice of penance in England from Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury, from 668 to 690, deriving from the Irish confession philosophy. Within the poem, Hinton reads the dream as a confession of sorts, ending with the narrator invigorated, his spirit longing to start